The city below was a circuit board of light, a silent, sprawling network of veins pumping with electricity and secrets. From the penthouse of the Onyx Tower, it looked like a map, a territory, and Julian Thorne was its undisputed king. The air in the room was cold, filtered, and utterly still. It smelled of nothing, which was exactly how he preferred it. The only sound was the faint, near-subliminal hum of the climate control system and the quiet clicks of his fingers on a tablet displaying encrypted shipping manifests. He sat behind a desk of polished obsidian that seemed to absorb all light, a black hole in the center of the room. His suit was black, custom-tailored, a second skin of impeccable wool and silk. It was a uniform of absolute authority. His second-in-command, Leo Vance, stood near the floor-to-ceiling armored glass, a stark silhouette against the glittering expanse of the metropolis. Leo was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, his face a roadmap of old conflicts, his loyalty to Julian a thing as solid and silent as the tower itself. He never spoke unless it was necessary. For the last hour it had not been necessary. Julian's world was one of meticulous order. Every variable was accounted for, every risk calculated, every human element managed with a precision that bordered on the inhuman. He was called the architect for a reason. He did not simply run a criminal syndicate. He had designed an empire of shadows that operated with the flawless logic of a machine. Emotions were friction. They were unpredictable data points that could corrupt the system. He had long ago purged them from his own code. Then a sound cut through the sterile silence. It was a sharp, insistent ringing from a single phone on his desk. It was a satellite phone, a ghost line reserved for emergencies of a magnitude that had not occurred in over 5 years. Julian did not flinch. His eyes, dark and unreadable, lifted slowly from the tablet. Leo turned from the window, his hand instinctively moving to the inside of his jacket. The sound was a violation, an alarm bell in their sanctuary of control. Julian let it ring 3 times, a small test of his own composure. He watched the light on the device blink, a tiny, frantic heartbeat in the otherwise dead calm room. Finally, he picked up the receiver. His voice was low, devoid of inflection. Yes, the voice on the other end was frantic, a woman's, choked with a nervous energy that felt abrasive in the cold air of the penthouse. Are you Julian Thorne? She sounded young, overwhelmed. A nurse, perhaps, or a resident. Her voice was thin, reedy. Julian's eyes narrowed. No one called this line unless they already knew precisely who he was. It was a test, a trick. He glanced at Leo, a flicker of a look that communicated everything. Trace this now. Who is calling? He asked, his tone dropping a degree colder. My name is Sarah. I'm a nurse at St. Michael's Mercy Hospital. He could hear the chaotic symphony of a hospital in the background, the rhythmic beeping of a monitor, a distant, garbled page over an intercom, the hurried footsteps. We have a patient here, a Jane Doe. She was brought in about an hour ago, gunshot wound to the abdomen. She's in critical condition, but she's conscious on and off, and she keeps saying your name. Julian felt a flicker of irritation. A trap, obvious and clumsy. Someone was trying to draw him out. Hundreds of men are named Julian, he stated flatly. You have the wrong number. He began to lower the receiver. No, wait, please, the nurse said, her voice rising in desperation. She said Julian Thorne, over and over. It's the only thing she's said that makes any sense. We don't have any identification for her, no purse, no phone. We don't know who to call. Your name was the only lead we had. We found a few public records for a Julian Thorne with significant corporate holdings, and this number it was attached to a private security firm listed in one of the files. It was a long shot. A long shot. He nearly smiled. These people had no idea what kind of line they had stumbled upon. His irritation solidified into a decision. This was a distraction, a piece of noise designed to pull his attention from more important matters. His rival, Marcus Valerius, was making moves on the docks. This had the man's sloppy, theatrical signature all over it. My condolences for your patient, Julian said, the words clipped and final. I can't help you. He was about to sever the connection when the nurse spoke again, her words tumbling out in a rush, a last-ditch effort. She's holding something. We couldn't get it out of her hand, even after she was sedated. She's clenching it so tightly. It's a locket, a small silver oval locket. It has a bird etched on it. A little swallow, I think. The world stopped. The hum of the climate control faded. The city lights outside the window blurred into a meaningless smear of color. The obsidian desk beneath his hands felt like ice. A bird, a small silver oval locket with a tiny etched swallow. Time didn't just stop. It folded back on itself, pulling him through a decade of calculated, disciplined emptiness to a single insignificant afternoon. It had been raining, a soft, persistent spring drizzle that made the city smell of wet pavement and damp earth. He had been in a small, independent coffee shop on a street he never used, a place with worn wooden floors and the rich, warm scent of roasting beans. It was a rare, unplanned deviation, a moment of unstructured time he had allowed himself after closing a particularly bloody transaction. He was not the architect in that moment. He was just a man in a dark coat, nursing a black coffee, a ghost observing the mundane lives of others. Then she had walked in, shaking the rain from her hair. She was not a woman who would command attention in a room full of noise and glamour. There was a quietness about her, an intelligence in her soft, hazel eyes. She ordered a tea, and as she turned from the counter, her canvas bag slipped, spilling its contents across the floor. A wallet, keys, a handful of pens, and a single worn paperback book. He had bent down instinctively, his hand closing around the book before he had even processed the action. Wuthering Heights. The cover was creased, the spine broken. He had handed it to her, their fingers brushed. It was nothing, a spark of static electricity, but it felt like a current had passed between them. She had looked up at him, and her smile was like a sudden sunrise in the gloomy cafe. "Thank you," she had said, her voice gentle. "My favorite. A bit dramatic for some, but I loved the sheer, untamed passion of it." He saw the locket then, resting in the hollow of her throat, a simple silver oval on a delicate chain. He had noticed the tiny etched bird on its surface. A swallow. He, a man who dealt in the cold currency of power and fear, had found himself momentarily speechless. He simply nodded, his mind, usually a fortress of strategy and logic, suddenly empty. The intensity of their shared gaze lasted only a second, maybe two. But in that second, he felt a fissure open in the foundation of his carefully constructed world. A feeling he couldn't name, something warm and chaotic and dangerous, had looked out from inside him. She had gathered her things, given him one last small smile, and then she was gone, the bell over the door tinkling softly in her wake. He never saw her again. He didn't even know her name, but he had never forgotten her. That one brief, accidental encounter had become a secret memory, a tiny, flawed piece of data he could not delete from his internal hard drive. It was a ghost that walked the corridor of his mind during the quietest hours of the night, a symbol of a different path, a different man he might have been in another life, a life he had long ago sacrificed for the one he now commanded. Clara, the barista had called her Clara as she left. That was it. Clara. "Sir?" The nurse's voice pulled him back to the present. The word was a question, laced with concern. He was still silent. The receiver felt heavy in his hand, a conduit to a past that was now violently colliding with his present. Leo watched him, his expression uncharacteristically troubled. He had seen Julian face down assassins, betrayals, and the collapse of rival families without so much as a change in his breathing. But now his boss was frozen, his knuckles white where he gripped the phone. For the first time in their long association, Leo Vance saw a crack in the armor of the architect, and it terrified him. "Is the locket still in her possession?" Julian's voice was different now. It was still low, but it was raw, stripped of its icy composure. It was the sound of grinding stone. "Yes," the nurse confirmed, sounding relieved to get a response. "She won't let it go." "Sir, do you know her? Is she family?" Family. The word was a bitter irony. He had no family. He had assets. He had soldiers. He had enemies. Family was a liability, a weakness he had long since amputated from his life. And yet, This woman, this ghost from a rainy afternoon, was lying in a hospital bed, bleeding, whispering his name. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a clumsy trap by Valerius. It was something far more insidious. Valerius hadn't just found a weakness. He had created one. He had reached back a decade into Julian's past, plucked out the one moment of vulnerability he had ever allowed himself, and had put a bullet in it. He had taken a memory and turned it into a target. A rage unlike anything Julian had ever experienced began to build inside him. It was not the cold, calculated anger he used as a tool to control his subordinates and intimidate his enemies. This was a hot, white inferno. It was personal. It was the primal fury of a predator whose hidden lair has been discovered and defiled. The feeling was so intense it was almost nauseating. The control he cherished, the perfect, ordered world he had built, was fracturing under the weight of a single name, Clara. "Which room is she in?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Room 304 in the West Wing ICU, the nurse replied, taken aback by the sudden shift in his tone. "But sir, access is restricted. Only immediate family." Julian hung up. The click of the receiver echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the penthouse. He stood up, his movements stiff, mechanical. The meticulously ordered shipping manifests on his tablet were now just meaningless pixels. The city outside was no longer a map of his power. It was a hunting ground, and the prey had just become the hunter. "Leo," he said, his back to his lieutenant. His voice was dangerously quiet. "Sir," Leo responded instantly, stepping forward. He was waiting for orders. An order to erase the hospital's records. An order to send a team to secure the floor. An order to find Marcus Valerius and bring him to this room in pieces. He was prepared for anything, but the order that came was not one he could have ever anticipated. "Clear my schedule for the rest of the week." Leo stared at Julian's back. The rest of the week? They were in the middle of a hostile takeover of the Port Authority. Valerius was making daily provocations. A week of Julian's absence was an eternity. It was an invitation for chaos. "Sir, with respect, Valerius." Julian turned, and for the first time, Leo truly understood the meaning of the phrase, "a killing look." The cold, calculating intelligence in Julian's eyes was gone. It had been replaced by something ancient and merciless. A storm of pure, unadulterated fury. It was the look of a man who had been pushed past his absolute limit. A man who was about to burn the world down to find what he was looking for. "Valerius is a dead man," Julian stated. It was not a threat. It was a simple, undeniable fact, delivered with the certainty of a prophecy. He just doesn't know it yet. Two other men, senior lieutenants who had been waiting silently in an adjoining alcove for their evening briefing, watched the scene, their faces pale. They had never heard the boss speak like this. They had never seen that look in his eyes. They were soldiers in a well-oiled machine, and the machine's architect was suddenly behaving in a way that was not in the schematics. Julian walked past them without a word. He didn't grab a weapon. He didn't issue a string of commands. He simply shrugged on his long black overcoat, the movement sharp and violent. His face was a mask of cold fury, a sculpture of stone and shadow. Every ounce of his formidable self-control was now focused on a single point, a single destination. St. Michael's Mercy Hospital. He did not delegate this. He did not send his men. He was going himself. The architect was leaving his tower not to oversee a transaction or to broker a deal, but to stand vigil over a ghost. The doors of the private elevator slid open, and he stepped inside without looking back. As the polished steel doors slid shut, they reflected the stunned, fearful faces of his most trusted men, left behind in the silent, cold heart of an empire whose master had just declared war. The city blurred into streaks of gold and crimson light through the armored glass of the sedan. Rain began to fall, slicking the streets with a dark, reflective sheen. Inside the car, the silence was a physical weight. Leo Vance drove with unwavering focus, his eyes scanning the road, the mirrors, the alleys they passed. He did not speak. He did not need to. The atmosphere was thick with a cold, controlled fury that emanated from the man in the back seat. Julian Thorne stared out the window, but he saw nothing of the city he owned. His reflection stared back, a mask of stone, but behind his eyes, a fire was raging, threatening to burn down the entire world. The phone call had been a crack in the foundation of his life. A single name, Clara, whispered by a stranger, had sent a tremor through his fortress of solitude. He remembered the locket, small, silver, an intricate pattern of vines. He had only seen it for a moment, years ago, but the image was etched into his mind with the precision of a blueprint. Everything in Julian's life was calculated, organized, and accounted for. This woman, this memory, was the single chaotic element he had allowed himself to keep. A secret indulgence. A moment of warmth he would revisit in the coldest hours of the night. Now his enemies had found it. They had taken his one piece of protected softness and had tried to break it. The thought was not just infuriating. It was a violation of the deepest, most sacrosanct part of himself. The part he never showed anyone. The part he barely admitted to himself. The car slid to a silent stop before the glass doors of St. Michael's Mercy Hospital. The emergency entrance was a flurry of frantic activity and harsh fluorescent light. Leo killed the engine but did not move to open the door. He simply waited, a statue of loyalty. Julian pushed the door open himself, stepping out into the damp night air. The scent of rain, antiseptic, and exhaust filled his lungs. He did not pause. He moved through the automatic doors with a purpose that parted the crowds before him. Nurses and orderlies stopped their hurried movements. A security guard took one step forward, then froze, his training warring with a primal instinct that told him to stand down. Julian's gaze swept across the waiting area, a chaotic sea of grief and anxiety. He ignored it all, his eyes locking on the reception desk. A flustered administrator looked up, ready to deliver a practiced, dismissive line. The words died on her lips. She saw the custom-tailored black suit that fit him like a second skin. She saw the unyielding set of his jaw. But most of all, she saw his eyes. They were dark, devoid of patience, and held an authority that needed no title or badge. "I am here for the woman who was brought in an hour ago," Julian said. His voice was low, clipped, and carried an absolute expectation of obedience. "Gunshot wound. She is unidentified." The administrator fumbled with her keyboard, her fingers suddenly clumsy. "Sir, I'm sorry, but due to patient privacy, we can't release any information without." Julian took a single step closer to the desk. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. He simply held her gaze. The air grew cold. The background noise of the emergency room seemed to fade away. In that silent moment, she understood that hospital protocols were a flimsy shield against a man like this. He was not asking for permission. He was informing her of what was about to happen. Her bravado crumbled. "Room 307, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Intensive care wing. She's just been moved from surgery." Julian gave a curt nod, already turning away. Leo was right behind him, a silent shadow, his presence a clear and unspoken warning to anyone who might think of interfering. They moved through the corridors, their polished leather shoes making no sound on the linoleum floors. The hospital was a maze of pale green walls and hushed urgency. The rhythmic beeping of machines grew louder as they approached the intensive care unit. A nurse at the station looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and alarm. "Excuse me, you can't go in there," she started, rising from her chair. "Family only, and visiting hours are EO." Leo stepped in front of her, his large frame blocking her path. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her. His expression was not unkind, but it was absolute. It said, "Do not pursue this." The nurse swallowed hard and sat back down, her eyes wide. Julian reached the door marked 307. For the first time since the phone call, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the cool metal of the handle. Behind this door was the collision of his two worlds. The brutal, violent reality of his present and the fragile, sacred memory of his past. A part of him, a deeply buried, long-forgotten part, was terrified of what he would find. He, who feared nothing and no one, was afraid of seeing her broken. He clenched his jaw, forcing the feeling down. Fear was a luxury. Weakness was a death sentence. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dim, illuminated only by the faint glow of the city outside and the cold digital light of the monitors beside the bed. The only sound was the steady, soft beep of the heart monitor, a fragile rhythm in the crushing silence. And there she was, Clara. She was smaller than he remembered, paler. Her face, which lived in his memory as animated and full of light, was now still and ashen against the white pillow. An IV line snaked into the back of her hand. A bandage was wrapped around her shoulder, a stark white patch against the pale blue of the hospital gown. She was a landscape of vulnerability, and for a man whose entire existence was built on control, the sight of her lying there completely at the mercy of fate and doctors was a form of torture. A profound, unfamiliar sense of helplessness washed over him. He could command armies of men. He could topple financial empires with a single phone call. He could make the most powerful people in the city tremble. But he could not reach into her body and command the bullet to undo its damage. He could not order her heart to beat stronger. He could not erase the pain. In this room, his power meant nothing, and the impotence of it all stoked the embers of his rage into a white-hot inferno. This was his fault. He had kept her memory like a treasure, but his world had still found a way to poison it, to poison her. He moved to the side of the bed, his movements unnaturally quiet. He looked down at her face, tracing the lines of it with his eyes. The soft curve of her cheek, the faint spray of freckles across her nose he had forgotten about until this very moment. Her lips were slightly parted, her breathing shallow. Her hair, a warm brown, fanned out across the pillow. The urge to reach out, to touch her, to smooth the hair from her forehead was so strong it was a physical ache in his chest. But his hands, which had signed orders that ended lives, felt clumsy and unworthy. What comfort could a man like him offer? His touch was a currency of violence and control, not tenderness. As he stood there, a silent, dark sentinel, the sterile environment of the hospital room began to dissolve. The rhythmic beep of the monitor faded, replaced by the gentle hiss of an espresso machine and the soft drumming of rain against a large window. The antiseptic smell was gone, replaced by the rich, earthy scent of roasted coffee and damp earth. He was back. 5 years ago, a small, independent coffee shop downtown called The Daily Grind. It was a refuge he sometimes allowed himself on rainy afternoons, a place where no one knew his name, a place where he could be just a man in a suit, reading the financial news. He had been sitting in a worn leather armchair in the corner, watching the rain wash the city clean. And then she had walked in, shaking the water from her coat. She was like a splash of color in a gray world. She had a bright scarf wrapped around her neck and a smile that seemed to fight back the gloom of the day. He watched as she ordered a latte, her voice soft and clear over the hum of the cafe. He noticed the book she was clutching in her hand, its cover worn, its spine creased. She found a small table near the window, and as she sat down, fumbling with her coat and her bag, the book slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor with a soft thud. It slid halfway under his table. For a moment, he did not move. It was not his concern. He did not involve himself in the small accidents of strangers. But something compelled him. He leaned down, his suit jacket pulling tight across his shoulders, and picked it up. Wuthering Heights. He held it for a second, the worn paper soft against his fingertips. He had read it once, long ago, a lifetime ago. A story of savage, all-consuming passion, a love that was a destructive force of nature. He stood and walked a few steps to her table. "I believe this is yours." She looked up, startled. Her eyes, he saw then, were a warm, captivating hazel, flecked with green. A blush rose on her cheeks. "Oh, thank you so much. I'd be lost without it." "Wuthering Heights," he said, his own voice sounding foreign to him, lacking its usual clipped authority. "A difficult book. Not many people have the patience for it." Her face lit up with a genuine, brilliant smile. It hit him with the force of a physical blow. "Difficult? I think it's honest. Love isn't always neat and tidy, is it? Sometimes it's a storm, like Heathcliff. He's a monster, but you still feel the pain that made him that way." Julian was taken aback. Her simple observation cut straight to a truth he had spent his life bearing. The idea that monstrosity could be born from pain, that love could be a form of beautiful destruction. He, a man who saw the world in black and white, in assets and liabilities, was suddenly looking at a woman who saw all the complicated, messy shades in between. He was a man who lost his soul and tried to burn the world down to find it again. Julian found himself replying, the words coming from a place he didn't know he still had. Her eyes widened slightly, a look of surprise and intrigue on her face. She studied him for a long moment, as if seeing past the expensive suit and the severe expression for the first time. That's a perfect way to put it. Have you read it? A long time ago, he said. They stood there in a bubble of silence, the noise of the cafe fading around them. It was a moment of pure, unexpected connection, a meeting of two minds across a shared love for a tragic story. He wanted to ask her name. He wanted to sit down and ask her what other book she loved. He wanted to know everything about the person who could see the pain in a monster. But he did not. To do so would be to open a door. And Julian Thorne did not open doors he could not control. So he simply nodded. Enjoy your book. He turned and walked away, feeling her gaze on his back. He left the coffee shop and stepped back into the rain, back into his world of shadows and steel. He never saw her again. But he never forgot her. He never forgot the light in her eyes, or the way she talked about the pain that creates a monster. In the years that followed, her memory became a single perfect photograph in the locked gallery of his mind, a reminder of a different path, a different man he might have been. The sharp, insistent beep of the monitor pulled him violently back to the present. The coffee shop vanished. The scent of rain was gone. He was back in the cold, sterile room. He was back in a world where monsters were not characters in a book, but men who put bullets in innocent women to settle scores. He looked down at Clara, and the tender nostalgia of the memory curdled into a cold, hard knot of rage in his gut. That brief, perfect moment in the coffee shop was the reason she was lying here. His rival, Marcus Valerius, must have found out somehow. He must have discovered the one single thread of sentimentality Julian had allowed himself and had pulled on it, hoping to unravel him completely. He reached out, his hand finally closing over the cold metal of the bed rail. His knuckles were white. The rage was a living thing inside him now. It was a promise, a vow. Marcus would pay for this. He would not just be defeated. He would be dismantled, erased. Every part of his life, his business, his very existence would be turned to ash. For touching her, he would unmake him. As he stood there, lost in his dark promise of vengeance, a small sound broke the silence. A soft whimper. His eyes shot to her face, her eyelids fluttered. A faint line appeared between her brows as if she were caught in a painful dream. And then her lips moved, breathing out a single word, a name. Julian. It was not a question, it was a son, a piece of a half-remembered dream, a name she was clinging to in the darkness. It was the confirmation he dreaded and craved. In her delirium, in her pain, it was his name she was calling. As the sound of his own name from her lips echoed in the silent room, a single tear escaped the corner of her closed eye. It traced a slow, glistening path down her temple and disappeared into her hair. Julian watched its progress, his chest tightening until he could barely breathe. That one tear was more devastating than any physical blow. It was a testament to her suffering, and he was the cause of it. At that exact moment, the door opened quietly. A man in a white coat stepped inside, his face etched with professional concern and fatigue. It was the surgeon. He looked from the unconscious woman in the bed to the formidable dark figure standing beside her. The doctor cleared his throat, holding a chart in his hand. Mr. Thorne, I'm Dr. Evans. We managed to stabilize her, but the bullet's trajectory was complicated. It's lodged near a major artery. He paused, his expression grim. She needs another surgery to remove it. I have to be honest with you. Given its location and her current state, the procedure is extremely high risk. The doctor's voice was a flat, sterile instrument, delivering words that seemed to belong to another world. High risk, complications, uncertain outcome. Each syllable was a hammer blow against the fragile glass of Julian's composure. He had built an empire on certainty, on calculated risks and predictable results. Here, in this hallway that smelled of antiseptic and fear, there were no certainties. There was only the chaos of a human body fighting for its life, in the terrifying, absolute lack of control. He didn't respond to the doctor. He simply turned, his face a mask of stone that betrayed nothing of the storm raging within. The look in his eyes was enough. It made the seasoned surgeon take an involuntary step back. The drive back to the Onyx Tower was a silent, high-speed blur through the city's glittering veins. Rain began to fall again, streaking across the armored glass like tears. The city lights smeared into long, abstract paintings of gold and red. Julian saw none of it. He saw only her face, pale against the white hospital pillow. He heard only the faint, desperate whisper of his name, a name she had no reason to know, a name that had now, somehow, brought this ruin upon her. The helplessness he'd felt by her bedside was curdling, changing its chemical composition. It was hardening from a liquid grief into a solid, cold resolve. It was a feeling he knew well. It was the feeling that preceded destruction. When he swept back into the penthouse, the air itself seemed to drop 10 degrees. His men, who had been waiting in tense silence, straightened up as one. Their leader had returned, but the man who walked through the door was not the same one who had left. The cold precision was still there, but it was now powered by a furnace of royal fury that burned just beneath the surface. His eyes swept over them, dark and devoid of any light. They landed on Leo Vance. Leo stood apart from the others, his posture calm but alert. He was a man made of quiet loyalty and brutal efficiency. He had seen Julian in every state imaginable, but this was new. This was personal. Julian walked directly to him, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the polished black marble. He stopped, his presence a suffocating weight in the vast, silent room. He didn't need to raise his voice. His words were quiet, clipped, and lethally sharp. "Find who did this," he said. The order was absolute. It was not a request. It was a law of nature being spoken into existence. "I don't want a name. I want a soul. I want the man who pulled the trigger and the man who paid him. I want the driver of the car and the man who owns the car. I want every single link in the chain, from the bottom to the very top." He paused, his gaze locking with Leo's. "I want to know who dared to touch what was mine." The last three words hung in the air, heavy and possessive. Leo gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the confirmation Julian needed. There were no questions, no request for clarification. The mission was understood in its entirety. Without another word, Leo turned and walked out, his phone already in his hand. The other men, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, quietly dispersed, melting back into the shadows of the empire to begin their own work. Julian was finally alone. The silence of the penthouse, once a comfort, was now an accusation. It echoed with the beep of a heart monitor he could no longer hear. He walked past the vast, floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed his city, his kingdom, like a collection of jewels. He felt no pride, no sense of ownership. He felt only a hollow, aching void. His steps led him to the library, a room lined with dark mahogany shelves holding hundreds of books, most of them for appearance alone. But not all of them. He ran his hand along a specific section of ornate carved wood. A hidden panel clicked open, revealing a small, velvet-lined cavity within the wall. Inside lay a single object. It was a book, a pristine hardcover edition of Wuthering Heights. He had bought it 10 years ago, the day after he met her. He had never opened it. It was a totem, a perfect, untouched relic of a single perfect moment. A moment when a woman with warm hazel eyes and a smile that felt like sunlight had dropped her own worn copy. And he, for a reason he would never understand, had picked it up. Now he lifted his own copy from its hiding place. The spine was stiff. The pages were crisp and smelled of fresh paper and ink, a stark contrast to the scent of coffee and rain he remembered from hers. He carried it over to his massive desk and sat down, the leather of the chair groaning under his weight. For a long time he just looked at it. This book was a symbol of the one illogical, irrational, and deeply human thing he had allowed into his life, a secret garden he tended in the darkest corner of his mind. And now someone had found the gate. Someone had trampled the flowers and poisoned the soil. His fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he opened the cover. He didn't read it from the beginning. His eyes scanned the pages, hunting for the passages he somehow knew by heart. Absorbed through a strange osmosis of obsession, he found them. Words of a dark, all-consuming love. A love that was a sickness, a possession. a love that destroyed everything it touched. If all else perished and he remained, I should still continue to be. And if all else remained and he were annihilated, the universe would turn to a mighty stranger. He read the words, and they were not fiction. They were a diagnosis. The cold, logical architect of a criminal empire felt the chaotic, untamed soul of Heathcliff roaring inside him. He had spent his life building walls, creating order from violence, and suppressing every hint of emotional vulnerability. He had believed himself to be a fortress. But Clara was not a crack in the wall. She was a fault line running deep beneath the foundations, and the tremor from her injury was threatening to bring the entire structure down. He felt a rage so pure and so profound it was almost sublime. It was a rage directed at the person who did this, but also at himself, for his weakness, for allowing this one memory to flourish in secret, for having a vulnerability that could be found and exploited. His hand clenched into a fist on the desk, his knuckles white. He was a monster who protected his territory with cold, brutal force. But the thing they had attacked was not his territory, it was his soul. And he realized with a chilling clarity that he would burn the entire world to the ground to protect it. Hours bled into one another. The city outside his window went from the deep blue of twilight to the diamond-sharp black of midnight. The rain had stopped. Julian didn't move. The book lay open before him, a testament to his secret madness. The silence was finally broken by the soft sound of the door opening. Leo entered, his face as impassive as ever, but his eyes held a grim certainty. He held a small, encrypted tablet. He didn't speak until he was standing before the desk. "We have something," Leo said, his voice low and factual. He placed the tablet on the desk, swiping the screen to display a series of images and files. The shooter used a 9mm Sig Sauer, standard issue for a certain class of freelance professional. The shell casing was left behind intentionally. It's clean, too clean, wiped, but left as a calling card. Julian looked at the screen, a photograph of a single gleaming brass casing on wet asphalt. A message. Leo continued, his tone clinical. The shot placement was deliberate, lower abdomen, designed to cause a catastrophic but not instantly fatal injury. It was meant to ensure she ended up in a hospital. It was meant to create a period of prolonged suffering. His eyes met Julian's. It was meant to give you time to find out. The cold calculus of it settled in Julian's gut like ice. This wasn't a random mugging gone wrong. It wasn't a stray bullet from some street-level turf war. This was a performance, a piece of theater designed for an audience of one. The location, Leo went on, swiping to a map of the neighborhood, 3 blocks from her apartment. A quiet street, but one with a single CCTV camera on the corner of the intersection, partially obscured by a tree, just enough to capture a grainy image of the getaway vehicle, but not the license plate. Another deliberate breadcrumb. He pointed to the blurry shape of a black sedan on the screen. It's a Maserati Quattroporte, custom tint on the windows. There are only 3 of that specific model and year in the city. Julian's mind was already connecting the dots. This was sloppy, but it was an intelligent, calculated sloppiness. An invitation, a trail left not to be followed, but to be understood. One is registered to a tech billionaire who's been in Singapore for the last 6 months, Leo said, his voice flat. The second was reported stolen 2 weeks ago and found burned out in the Barrens yesterday morning, a full day before the shooting. A dead end. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. The third one is registered to a holding company, a company that serves as a front for Marcus Valerius. The name dropped into the silent room like a stone into a deep, dark well. Marcus Valerius, the peacock, the sadist, the one rival who matched Julian's ambition but had none of his control. Valerius was a man who delighted in psychological warfare, who saw cruelty not just as a tool but as an art form. While Julian built his empire on order and fear, Valerius built his on chaos and spectacle. He was the only person with the audacity, the theatricality, and the specific brand of viciousness to orchestrate such an attack. Not against Julian's business, but against his heart. Julian felt no surprise, only a profound, chilling sense of confirmation. The disparate, Disparate, painful pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a single hideous picture. His grief and fear for Clara did not vanish. Instead, they were forged by the fire of his rage into something new. A weapon, cold, sharp, and perfectly weighted. The hunt was over before it had even truly begun. He knew his target. He slowly closed the copy of Wuthering Heights, the sound a soft, final thud in the quiet room. He had been living with a ghost for 10 years. Now the ghost had been given flesh and blood, only to have it torn apart. The man responsible would not be met with a business proposition or a strategic maneuver. He would be met with an annihilation. As if summoned by the thought, a sharp electronic trill cut through the silence. It wasn't the main office line or his standard mobile. It was the other phone, the small, heavily encrypted device he kept for only the most critical, untraceable communications. It almost never rang. Julian looked at the screen. The number was blocked. He already knew who it was. A cold smile, utterly devoid of humor, touched his lips. He had been planning a war. It seemed the enemy was calling to surrender his first soldier. Himself. Leo tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the inside of his jacket. Julian held up a single finger, stopping him. His own hand was perfectly steady as he picked up the phone and pressed the answer button, putting it on speaker for Leo to hear. He said nothing. He just waited. For a moment, there was only the faint hiss of an open line. Then a voice slid through the speaker. It was smooth, almost purring, and dripping with a false, oily sympathy that made Julian's skin crawl. "Julian, my friend," the voice cooed. It was Marcus Valerius. "I hear your little secret isn't feeling so well." He let out a soft, theatrical sigh. A shame. The line went dead. Julian Thorne did not lower the phone. He held it to his ear for a long moment, listening to the empty, electronic hum. It was the sound of a gauntlet being thrown down, the sound of a line being crossed. Marcus Valerius had not just declared war. He had taken a blade to the one nerve Julian Nistim and had spent a lifetime pretending did not exist. The air in the Onyx Tower penthouse was suddenly too thin, too cold. He could feel the city lights pressing against the armored glass, a million silent witnesses to a failure he could not yet articulate. His knuckles were white where he gripped the phone. He lowered it slowly, placing it back on the polished mahogany desk, with a precision that defied the storm raging inside him. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. His men, stationed just outside the office, would be waiting for an order to burn something to the ground, an order to erase a name from the city's ledgers. That was his language. It was the only language his world understood. But the words would not come. The cold, calculating machinery of his mind had seized. One image overrode every tactical consideration, every protocol for retaliation. Clara, pale and still in a hospital bed. He turned from the desk and walked towards the door, his movement stiff. Leo Vance stood just outside, his face an unreadable mask of loyalty. He saw the look in Julian's eyes and knew. No questions were asked. No commands were needed. Julian moved past him, his steps echoing in the vast, empty corridor. He was leaving his fortress, his seat of power. He was walking away from the tools of his trade, the levers of control he used to bend the city to his will. He was going back to the one place he had no control at all, back to the antiseptic smell and the quiet, rhythmic beeping that measured a life he now valued more than his own. The war with Valerius could wait. The monster inside him would be fed. But first, he had to see if she was still breathing. The quiet of the private hospital room was a world away from the penthouse. Here, the only currency was the steady rise and fall of Clara's chest. Julian sat in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, his tailored suit a stark black slash against the room's sterile beige and white. He had been here for hours, unmoving, a statue carved from rage and fear. His men secured the entire floor, silent shadows in the hallways, ensuring no one entered without his permission. But they could not guard the door to his own mind. Behind his closed eyes, the taunting voice of Marcus Valerius echoed, "I hear your little secret isn't feeling so well." The casual cruelty of it was a poison. Valerius thought he was attacking a weakness. He did not understand. He was not attacking a weakness. He was forging a purpose. For years, Julian's purpose had been power, order. the silent and absolute dominion over his empire. Now it had collapsed into this single point of focus, this one woman. He watched the gentle flutter of her pulse on the monitor. Each beat was a defiance. Each soft breath she took was a victory against the chaos Valerius had unleashed. He remembered the coffee shop, the smell of rain on pavement, the way she had looked up at him when he handed her the fallen book. Her eyes were hazel, flecked with gold, and held a light he had never seen before. It was a light from a world he did not belong to, a world of quiet bookstores and rainy afternoons, a world where people were not pawns in a game of power. He had walked away from that moment, burying it deep within him. He told himself it was a fleeting, meaningless encounter, a ghost of a life he could never have. Now that ghost was flesh and blood, lying broken in front of him because of who he was. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He had built an empire of stone and steel to protect himself from feeling anything at all. He had walled off his heart so completely that most people, even those closest to him, doubted he had one. Yet this woman, a near stranger, had breached his defenses with a single shared glance over a worn paperback